Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 255. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
I'm great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well. Happy to have you back on today, Connor. We have a lot of news to get through, some stuff that I've been writing for the Libertarian Institute. Also, want to talk about your latest article for the Libertarian Institute that I think was quite powerful and, got some reactions on Twitter and everything, titled Don't Apologize, the Anti-War Movement Was Right. And so a lot of great stuff to talk about on today's show. If everybody could, we appreciate it if you could share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. And right now at the Institute, we have our spring fundraiser going on. So head on over there, donate to help support the work of myself and Connor Freeman, not only on conflicts of interest, but all the writing that we've been doing. I think at this point, me and Will have put together over 60 articles in the Institute news section in March alone. Connor has a weekly article. So we're putting a lot of hard work into the Institute. And if you want good non-mainstream media coverage of world events, you got to support different outlets. And I think we are doing some pretty great work at the Institute. So just want to start off the show by mentioning that. And then we also have the show, the video version, on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey. We post the show on the blog at antiwar.com. And then Facebook and Twitter. The Twitter handle is @con_interest. We also have a sponsor, Paloma Verde, palomaverdecbd.com. Promo code PEACE. You get 20% off. We get a kickback from that. All you got to do is spend $75 or more. And they have a great lineup of products at Paloma Verde. So if you're a CBD user, you could go on the website. You could see the high quality lab tested results right there. So you're getting great products. And then anywhere you've shopped, at least for me, for CBD, Paloma Verde's got what you're looking for. So again, great way to support the show, support yourself, get good high quality CBD products. PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. Connor, let's get into it. And we want to start off with some news on Iran today. And the first article I actually wrote up just this morning before we started the show, and it's titled at the Libertarian Institute, U.S. hits Iran with new sanctions amid nuclear negotiations. I write, the Treasury Department announced a new round of sanctions targeting Iran, as well as talks to save the nuclear agreement are very close to a deal. The Treasury will blacklist Mohammed Ali Hosseini and a network of companies. The U.S. alleges Hosseini uses the companies to procure parts for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' missile program. According to the press release, the sanctions are a response to Iran's missile attack in Erbil on March 13th and Iranian enabling Houthi missile attacks against a Saudi Aramco facility on March 25th, as well as other missile attacks by Iranian proxies against Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Iran claims responsibility for the attack in Erbil. Tehran says it was a response to Israeli strikes in Syria that killed 2 members of the IRGC and an Israeli attack on a drone base inside of Iran. 3 successive American presidents have claimed that Iran enables Ansar Allah, the Houthis, to attack Saudi Arabia and the UAE. However, the U.S. has failed to produce evidence to bat these assertions. Similarly, the Treasury Department statement does not provide proof of Iran's or Hosseini's ties to the Houthi missile program. The latest sanctions on Iran add to the maximum pressure economic war that began under President Donald Trump. The economic war started after Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. Iran responded to the U.S. by walking back from its commitments per the agreement. President Joe Biden's government has been in negotiations with Tehran for several months in an effort to get both sides to return to the deal. However, America's refusal to remove the sanctions has been a crucial sticking point in the current talks to save the nuclear agreement. According to EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell, Iran demands that the IRGC be removed from America's terrorism blacklist is one of the remaining issues. President Joe Biden is reported to be considering removing the terrorism designation on the IRGC. The latest sanctions targeting Hosseini, alleged ties to the IRGC, could send a signal to Iran that Biden is still committed to Trump's maximum pressure policy. And so, again, Connor, that was just this morning, March 30th, that we got that announcement from the Treasury Department. And not really a great sign for diplomacy, but maybe you have some other good news for us on these Iran negotiations. So, what else is going on, Connor?
Well, I ordinarily try to be a little bit more optimistic about lifting the sanctions on Iran and returning to the deal. And I think it did seem up until essentially this week, this kind of I mean, it seems like for more than a month, uh, I guess the last couple of months, it seemed like a deal is imminent. I mean, that's the phrase that's used commonly, particularly by the EU diplomats, Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, Enrique Mora, the sort of the broker of the talk, the overall broker of the talks in Vienna. And it seems like every obstacle that comes up is usually, overcome. That there's some sort of an agreement, like with when the Russians were concerned that the sanctions would get in the way of their business with Iran and processing uranium and fuel being shipped to Russia, et cetera. That these kinds of things were totally resolved. In fact, they said it was written into the new version of the agreement that is yet to be finalized, but is, almost there, according to basically all accounts. And it's even the strike. I didn't, at first I sort of thought that the strike in Damascus wouldn't be such a damaging factor in the return to the deal. You did, and at first I was like, but Israel bombs Syria so often, and Iran, will say, we'll get you back, and you won't get away with this, and we vow revenge and this sort of thing. But they've done that, and the Syrians have done that for years, and nothing usually comes of it. I mean, there's different kinds of retaliation that happen, but for the most part, Israel bombs the country every week and doesn't really suffer any consequences. Even when Russia complains about it, nothing really happens. I mean, they're flying the joint air patrols with Syria now, and they still bomb the country almost weekly at this point still. So, but then there was I didn't realize it came out after the strike in Erbil, that there had been these successive drone strikes in Iran that we covered 2 weeks ago, which seemed to me like a major escalation. So the strike in Kurdistan seemed to be a real substantive response, and I have to assume, even though there hasn't been any proof, that there was smoke where there might have been some fire there with that smoke in terms of their accusations about there being a Mossad site, because as we said, the last time they fired ballistic missiles into Iraq was after the Americans assassinated Qasem Soleimani, their top general, at the Baghdad International Airport. So it seems like this was a major response to a series of significant provocations and attacks, and that actually killed, IRGC members. Now, the main sticking point on sanctions at this point appears to be the removal of this foreign terrorist designation. They're on the foreign terrorist organization blacklist. This is the main thing that the Iranians want in order to return to the deal. So at this point, it seems like. So I have a couple of reports here from antiwar.com just to start really quick, as far as like how quickly we went from we're almost there to I don't know. So Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, Jason Ditz reports here that he says, let's see, he says they're very close. This is from March 27th, and he says the deal could come in a matter of days. But he says that, Iran seems to be, as Jason reports here, that at the time it looked like Iran was, scrapping their concerns about the IRGC being on the terror list, and that it would be a part of a separate deal, if anything. And Iran seems to support that idea, and the status seemed to not be an issue. It wouldn't impact the negotiations on Vienna that relate directly to the JCPOA. And now, of course, we have American politicians making a big deal about this, and I think we'll find that one of the reasons for that, we reported, I think maybe in January, we discussed there was a great expose in Mint Press News about this major push by the Israel lobby, along with members of Congress in a bipartisan, bicameral sort of coalition to really push Biden and his administration to boost and expand the Abraham Accords, which are really, I mean, the main justification for. So the real reason for it, I suppose you could say, is first of all, it benefits the military industrial complex because there's a lot of welfare that goes to these states that normalize, in quotes, their relationship with Israel. They're not really enemies with Israel, but the gain for the Israelis and the major Zionist factions here in America, the Mike Pompeo types, is that it sets a precedent, as Pompeo was so proud to say, where basically they throw the Palestinians under the bus, these Arab states, by saying essentially, we will normalize with Tel Aviv even if there's no change. Like, even if the Palestinians are not granted their human rights or granted independence under a single democratic state, or there's any kind of a move toward a real two-state solution in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, or freeing the people, or having the Israelis leave the Golan Heights and end the occupation there. That is all swept under the rug, and there's these sort of pomp and circumstance, and Donald Trump used it to kind of boost his electoral chances, for his own political gain, to try and get a foreign policy win in the run up to his the presidential election with Biden in 2020. So they did all of this. And of course, there were billions of dollars in weapons that were sold to the UAE. I mean, they were selling them F-35s and Reaper drones and, I think 14,000 different munitions and things like this. I mean, if you look at it, the Biden administration last year, I would have to argue, much like other policies of the Trump administration, seems to have gone ahead and escalated those policies anyway. I'm not even sure. I mean, maybe they wanted Blinken to do more of these events like he did recently in Israel that we'll talk about, where he meets with the foreign ministers from Bahrain, the UAE, and Morocco, and Yair Lapid, his Israeli counterpart, and they all talk about how, isn't this great? But truthfully, if you look at it, so I pulled up some old reports that we had covered last year from antiwar.com, where Dave DeCamp is reporting on how, Benny Gantz went to Bahrain and signed a military pact with them, that they were going to increase intelligence cooperation, that they they were going to build stronger ties between their defense industries and create a framework for further military exercises. The U.S. had held in the Red Sea, and this was totally a provocation. They were sending a message to Iran. They were holding drills in the Red Sea, training basically on how to, do the kind of thing where they, take over oil tankers and ships like this, basically state piracy. But they were doing these joint training exercises with Israel, Bahrain, and the UAE. Israel has attacked Iranian ships in the Red Sea. So it's extremely provocative. And there were other drills subsequent to that, where you had the Navy holding, massive drills with even more nations involved. But it got to the point where they even had Saudi Arabia and Oman involved in these exercises with Israel and these states, which was a first. Israel had not done any kind of joint military exercises with Saudi Arabia or Oman up to that point. And so this is all being, facilitated by the Biden administration. In fact, we discussed as well that Biden's nominee for the new head of CENTCOM has basically said he's thrilled at the prospect of increasing military and ties with these states, particularly Israel and the UAE, and talking about how they can basically share intelligence and work on like air defense and stuff because of the Houthis, who they always paint as like an Iran proxy. And that's a lot of what is being discussed. They're sort of using the escalation that Biden greenlit for Riyadh and Abu Dhabi to save face for the war that Riyadh was losing in Yemen. So now they've increased, as we talked about last week, the airstrikes and just bomb the hell out of Yemen. And now when the Houthis fire back, like on these oil facilities in the UAE or in Saudi Arabia, then they use that as a justification to increase military ties directly, the U.S. with those states, but also with Israel. And Israel, as soon as like the UAE got hit, I don't remember. I think it might have been the president that traveled there. I don't think it was Bennett, but they immediately offered like security and intelligence ties, and there was discussion of even like I believe there was discussion of them even providing like Iron Dome technology and this kind of thing. But anyway, so Borrell says this on the 27th, that they're very close to getting to a deal. But then on the 29th, Jason Ditz reports at antiwar.com that he's saying, sometimes you think you're almost there and other days you're not. And now he's saying that it's Iran that is the cause of the holdup, because they're saying that they're not budging essentially on this issue of the IRGC being removed from the foreign terrorist organization blacklist. And even though that was previously supposed to be a separate thing, another thing Jason notes here is that Borrell offered some details on what's been happening in recent weeks, including that one of Russia's concerns was that sanctions relief would put Iran's oil back on the market, lowering prices and potentially costing Russian oil major revenues. And he says it was resolved with a confidential assurance to Russia on overall trade, which is interesting because the U.S. is very much resisting any deals with Russia recently. And he indicated that he'll be and he has been making trips to Tehran. And now I believe he visited D.C. on Monday. I haven't seen too many reports coming out about what happened there. I'm sure we will see soon. And then, of course, Vienna. So to start with the whole to start with the issue of the Revolutionary Guards, there's a great piece from Responsible Statecraft out right now by Paul Pillar. And I want to get your thoughts, especially on why Iran is so concerned about this foreign terrorist organization designation, because I believe there's an issue of criminal charges that are possible here. But at the same time, Paul Pillar makes the point that, and as Robert Malley is saying and reiterating constantly now, is that he's the special envoy for Iran that Biden has selected. And he said, Paul Pillar makes a point that even if they're removed from it, which there's no justification, he says, first of all, for them to be on it, because this was set up under the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 96. The point of it is to prohibit Americans from wittingly or unwittingly funding terrorist organizations that don't receive regular funding. So he talks about how there's I believe 73 people on the list. 72 are non-state groups, which is how the law is written. It's supposed to be that way. And there were no lists of terrorist groups, he says, until 96, such as this. But regardless, the IRGC does not fit the description of what is supposed to be on the list. This was added by the Trump administration in 2019 as part of the maximum pressure campaign. They were trying to throw everything they could at the wall and also make it as difficult as possible for the next administration, likely a Democrat, or if it was obviously Biden, to remove these sanctions and to return to the deal. And Elliot Abrams and people like that were making that clear, that they were adding, especially toward the end of the administration, sanctions every week to make sure that it would be as difficult as possible, if not impossible, for them to lift the sanctions and return to the deal. So before I get more into that, I want to talk to you about what your opinion is on the foreign terrorist designation. The foreign terrorist organization designation issue is, and why Iran is making this. They're not budging on this. Amir Abdollahian, the foreign minister, made that clear to Enrique Mora this weekend.
Yeah. So I think there's probably several levels to it, right? The first is that this is the main part of Iran's military. This is sanctioning Iran's foreign policy. That's what this is about. And so Iran, I think, has been very clear. They're not willing to make additional concessions than what they made in the initial JCPOA to get America and Iran back into compliance with that initial deal. And I think they would see allowing their military to be sanctioned as an additional concession. But not only that, it's aimed at constraining their foreign policy in the Middle East. And then the second thing, Iran being on the terrorism list has a lot of political implications, right? This could be used to say Iran's the leading state sponsor of terror. Look, theirs is the only military on the terrorism list, and things like that, that, these different public commenters are going to say. But also, who does Iran actually support? It's Hezbollah mainly, Assad, the Shia in Iraq, and I guess to some extent the Palestinians and the Houthis. And so if Iran is a state sponsor of terror, then that means all these groups are terrorists. And that's another real problem. And so I think that by removing it, it actually made some better ground for the US and Iran to have diplomacy in the future. However, if Iran's IRGC remains sanctioned, then it pretty much guarantees constant conflict and everything like that, because they're going to claim that everything going into Iran is for the IRGC, and hell of a lot of it is, and then they're going to just sanction everything in Iran, right? And so this is going to be a way around it. But also the terrorism sanctions are more significant. They hold more criminal weight than other sanctions do. And so I think that could also be a part of it. Further, Iranians have been subject to, American prison time for sanctions violations. It's not like there's no concern about it, or it's like, oh, it's just the Ayatollah worried about his bank accounts. There people have faced punishment for this, and it's definitely hurt the Iranian economy, all these sanctions.
Yeah, I believe I've heard Dave DeCamp mention that it's either it's all current members of the organization at every level, or all previous members are subject to these sanctions if they remain. So yeah, it's very serious, and then very serious. And then of course the axis of resistance. Soleimani being kind of the before he was killed, the figurehead of that, somewhat loosely knit grouping of different groups that are opposing American, Israeli, and Saudi imperialism in the region. And so the IRGC obviously is, very relevant to that, and it's obviously a gift to the Israel lobby to leave that there so that they can continue to use that as a way, as you say, and these other states, these other Gulf states that are totally opposed to return to the deal, who like having the Iranian boogeyman maybe as much as the Israelis, to continue the flow of military aid. And I think that a lot of these Gulf states are realizing they have more leverage with the Americans than they, or maybe actually they're just sort of testing it now and they already knew that. But I mean, if this does signal a change in policy, it might be a reflection of just the Saudis and the Emiratis not going along with the Americans' demands. Even the Israelis haven't been, for how to deal with Russia in the wake of this invasion in Ukraine. So now, I mean, I don't know if this. I mean, it does seem to me that from the beginning with the Biden administration, and particularly even as things seem to become more optimistic, and we were getting better news about it as the Iranians were succeeding in the negotiations beginning after the seventh round or so of negotiations, and particularly starting in late December. But there's obviously some sort of there's factions in the Biden administration. And I don't think people like Blinken and Sullivan are very keen on returning to the deal. In fact, Blinken threatened over the weekend that they would work with their allies to turn up the pressure on Iran. He said, we're still seeking a diplomatic outcome here that puts Iran's nuclear program back in a box. But we're ready with our it's a paraphrase, but is ready to work with its partners to increase pressure on Tehran if diplomacy fails. So getting back to basically the talks with the different diplomats and things over the weekend, Enrique Mora was in Tehran. And was talking about this issue, the foreign terrorist organization, with Ali Bagheri Khan, who's the lead negotiator in Vienna for the Iranians, and Hossein Amir Abdollahian. Now, both of them said that if the American side is realistic, an agreement can be reached to revive the JCPOA. But and apparently they say the diplomat, I'm assuming they're referring to Amir Abdollahian, the foreign minister. He said that senior IRGC members have told him that talks should not be stalled by the issue of the designation if an agreement is within reach. But Amir Abdollahian has vowed that in spite of this self-sacrifice, he would not grant concessions on the issue. Now, this was also discussed at the Doha Forum International Conference. Kamal Karzai, who's a former Iranian foreign minister and a very close aide to the Ayatollah, said that the designation must be lifted, that several IRGC entities need to be delisted because they are integral to the Iranian economy. And Mali said that the final hurdles here are difficult to clear. And he's not confident a deal is imminent. And he says if the foreign terrorist organization designation is lifted, there's others that will remain in place. And as Lapid says, there's still the weapons proliferation, human rights abuses, election interference, and terrorism sanctions that will remain, apparently. And Blinken, in his press conference in Jerusalem before his talks with these Abraham's Accords foreign states, foreign ministers, was asked if the IRGC is a foreign terrorist organization. He said they're probably the most designated organization one way or another in the world among the organizations that we designate, including the foreign terrorist organization designation. And Lapid said that they're a terror organization that should be dealt with as such, and referred to their proxies across the region, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Islamic Jihad in Gaza. So, and let's see, there's a report here also from Al Jazeera on Blinken saying that the nuclear deal is the best way to cap nuclear activity. He's signaling that they'll be working with Israel to ensure that Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon. And it's not exactly clear what that would entail. They've many times said that they have basically approved Israel to virtually do whatever it wants in terms of, these sabotage attacks and even apparently these drone strikes on Iran. But they said when it comes to the most important element, Blinken said that Israel and the U.S. see eye to eye. They're committed and determined that Iran will never acquire a nuclear weapon. But this reporter from Al Jazeera reporting from West Jerusalem said that the Israeli prime minister is expressing deep concerns about the idea of the Revolutionary Guards being taken off the U.S. terror list, something certainly Blinken did not rule out in any way. And we know that the Israelis have been trying to sabotage this deal the entire time in various ways, and they obviously haven't given up. And let's see. So I also will just say that the aide I mentioned earlier, too, the Ayatollah, has said that the deal is in fact imminent, and he appeared to dispute what Mali was saying, and says that it just depends on the political will in the United States. So then the last thing I have is some material on the meeting in Israel with these Abraham's Accords states. Let's see. So this was held with the foreign ministers of the UAE. So this is Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan from the UAE, Morocco's Nasser Bourita, Bahrain's Abdul Latif bin Rashid Al Zayani, and their Egyptian counterpart, Sameh Sokri. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Here's one thing I picked up from Electronic Intifada. Apparently, participants were even served lamb from the occupied Golan Heights during the conference, which refers back, I would say, signals what I was saying earlier about throwing the Palestinians under the bus and basically anybody that's occupied by Israel. Now, let's see. Lapid says that they're working to build a new regional architecture that includes security and intelligence cooperation. He says the new architecture, the shared capabilities we are building, intimidates and deters our common enemies, first and foremost, Iran and its proxies. They certainly have something to fear. And he said that this conference will become a permanent forum. And then also point out that they discussed, according to the Wall Street Journal, the Israeli and Arab diplomats were discussing unprecedented formal defense partnerships, as well as new military and economic ties and a joint strategy for Iran. Let's see. Blinken said a more stable, integrated region gives us a stronger foundation for addressing shared threats like these. And he called the summit unthinkable just a few years ago. So they did not discuss whether the Abraham's Accords would expand into some sort of formal defense alliance and what role the U.S. would have in such an alliance. The Israeli ambassador to the UAE said the most important issue is sitting together. It's telling the world the region is united. They did mention here that Israel and the Arab partners, like I referred to earlier, are accelerating talks centered on missile and air defense systems aimed at countering, they say, Iran's large arsenal of medium-range missiles and armed drones. And they say, according to a senior U.S. official, that Saudi Arabia has held quiet talks with Israel on closer military cooperation. And also, they mentioned that Bennett, I believe, recently traveled to Egypt to meet with Mohammed bin Zayed and Sisi to discuss deepening security and economic ties and countering Iran as the tentative finalization of the JCPOA gets closer. Let's see. Now they just mentioned that they say that the Biden's policy, ostensibly returning to the JCPOA, is very divisive in the region, and they say that Israel and these Arab governments oppose it. They fear that lifting sanctions on Iran will embolden its leaders and pull the U.S. further back from the Middle East, following. You'll love this, Mr. Biden's abrupt withdrawal from Afghanistan last summer and his long-term foreign policy goal of pivoting toward China. Now, they say that U.S. and Iranian officials say they are on the cusp of the deal. The last sticking points are on this Iranian Revolutionary Guards force issue. And then they just essentially talk about the increasing ties in the region, which are obviously an indication, the UAE and Saudi Arabia talking with Turkey, Qatar being brought back into the fold, the UAE talking with Assad now. All these different things, I would argue. Although they're saying they're trying to reduce Iran's influence in the neighborhood, I'm not sure how that's exactly going to work out with Assad. But the point is, this all actually occurred because if you read Trita Parsian and El Shalin, as we've discussed, because these states believe that the U.S. was moving toward leaving the region and focusing more on China. But at the same time, they're trying to pull them back in. These kinds of things, I don't see them being as successful. And then they talk more and more about the differences that they're having with Israel and the Gulf states on the whole Russia-Ukraine issue. But that is most of what I had here today on the Iranian issue. It doesn't appear that I hope that they will be able to, as I say, surpass this issue. But with the new sanctions added today, it's exactly what didn't need to happen in order to reach the deal. So we'll have to see.
All right, Connor, I want to talk about the new budget that was proposed by the White House. It is $5.8 trillion in total spending for the fiscal year 2023, which begins at the beginning of October. There's been a lot of coverage on this from AntiWar.com, and then I've been writing it up at the Libertarian Institute. So I want to start off with Dave DeCamp's article from AntiWar.com. Biden requests $813 billion for 2023 military spending, and of that amount, $773 billion will go to the Pentagon, and the remaining funds will go towards other federal agencies for military programs, including the FBI and the Energy Department. Of course, with the Energy Department, it's taking care of the nuclear weapons and providing all of that. That's where the billions for the Energy Department go. Biden's request is $30 billion more than the $782 billion military budget that was authorized for the 2022 fiscal year, and represents a 4% increase. That might still not be enough for Republican odds who are looking for a 5% increase. And Connor, this is a massive bill, and we haven't been able to go through it all yet, but some of the different departments that are seeing a big increase in funding is the Space Force. This from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. Space Force sees 40% budget increase for modernization confronting Russia. The thing about the U.S. military budgets is that they tend to grow, and its officials think they got a good excuse. They grow precipitously. The new kid on the block, Space Force, is following this predictable trend and is shooting for a 40% increase in their annual budget, up to $24.5 billion in 2023. Superficially, the Space Force site a fast growing array of threats that could attack American interests in, though, and through space, citing the need for modernization of legacy programs. More specifically, the proposal is piggybacking on the Air Force One, which is seeking a boost spending to confront China. The Space Force is focused on tracking hypersonic missiles and protecting satellites from theoretical attacks. A lot of the Space Force schemes is purely theoretical and self-supporting, but they put very extensive hardware in some utility in space and then need to be bankrolled to make sure nothing happens to it. China has been a talking point from the start, though the hypersonic missiles also may play well as something to do with Russia given the current hostilities in Ukraine. It may be particularly galling, however, that the newly branded Space Force is already complaining that they've got obsolete equipment that needs to be replaced with costly alternatives. So, yeah, the Space Force is getting a big bump. In the Navy, they are retiring 24 ships and building 9 new ships, but don't think that means you're going to save any money. They're just building more expensive ships. And so I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute. Pentagon seeks to scrap problematic littoral combat ships in 2023. The Pentagon 2023 budget proposal calls for retiring 24 ships to make way for more expensive vessels. All 9 of the Navy's Freedom class littoral combat ships would be among those scrapped. And if you just go and look on Wikipedia, Connor, at the page, you can see that the latest LCF Freedom class ship to be commissioned was the USS St. Louis, and that was commissioned in 2020, so only 2 years ago. The LCS program has been plagued with issues. The most serious are failures in the propulsion system. Last year, a major defect was found in the transmission, causing new ships deliveries to be halted. The frequent issues have led to the nickname Little Crappy Ships. Many of the Freedom class crafts are cut to be the newest in the American fleet, with 5 ships commissioned in the past 4 years. Rear Admiral John Gobleton, the Navy budget chief, said the decision to scrap the vessels was a money-saving move. He said, a piece of that was our choosing after decommissioning vessels that were very expensive to maintain. He said the 24 would generate savings of $3.6 billion across the budget that I can reinvest. And I just couldn't get over this, Connor, that they're actually saying that we are scrapping ships that we built a couple of years ago, and that is somehow going to save the taxpayer money. It's just absolutely absurd and upsetting. Now, to go on with the article, the Pentagon was planning to buy an additional 6 Freedom class LCSs. It is unclear if those projects will be terminated, but you would almost assume they would have to be. Of the other 24 ships to be cut, it's 5 cruisers, 4 landing dot ships, 2 submarines, 2 oilers, and 2 expeditionary transfer dots are all also being retired. The Navy is also looking to add more nuclear powered ships like Ford class aircraft carriers and Columbia-class submarines. The DoD's new budget would bring the total number of ships down from 298 to 280. However, a lot of what analysts say you need to look at when you're talking about Navy ships is displacement and tonnage, which may actually go up when you're talking about building a Ford aircraft carrier versus scrapping one of these little crappy ships. However, the Congress may reject the Pentagon's suggestion to remove the ships from service. For example, the DoD's past efforts to eliminate the A-10 program were removed from the budget during the legislative process. Even if the ships are cut, the American taxpayers will not see savings, with the White House planning a $30 billion increase in war spending in 2023. And by the way, they do want to cut the A-10 program again in this budget, and my guess is once again it will not happen. And in fact, Connor, I almost suspect, not 100% sure on this, but I almost suspect that part of what they're thinking about doing here is they know programs that Congress will put back in the budget, so they say they'll cut them in order to be able to spend elsewhere, and then Congress will boost the budget later. I got another article at the Libertarian Institute about the budget, and Biden's budget includes billions for cyber warfare. The White House released a massive $5.8 trillion budget for the 2023 fiscal year. The spending proposal calls for the Pentagon to receive $11.2 billion for cyber operations, and $11 billion will be distributed to the rest of America's domestic government agencies for various cyber products. Under the spending plan, the Pentagon will expend its Cyber Command Mission Force, CMF. 5 new teams will be added to CMF, bringing the total to 142. According to a Department of Defense fact sheet, part of the team's mission is to carry out offensive cyberations intended to protect power in and through cyberspace through the employment of cyberspace capabilities. Outlined in the DoD budget is funding to invest in cyber training ranges, add more than $1 billion for the Navy's cybersecurity. The Pentagon has also said the budget will cover increasing cybersecurity to the defense industrial base. Overall, the $11.2 billion for the military cyber warfare is an 8% or $1.4 billion increase over the 2022 budget. Navy Vice Admiral Ronald Allen Botzall, the director for force structure, said this budget lays the foundation for U.S. Cyber Command to have ownership of the mission and cyber mission force. On the civilian side, the Department of Homeland Security will receive $2.5 billion for its Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. In November 2020, Gareth Porter raised questions about CISA's integrity. Porter explained that CISA only accused Russia of interference in the 2020 election after it appeared President Donald Trump's campaign was faltering. The Department of Veteran Affairs is scheduled to get $1.8 billion in its funding for its electronic health record modernization program. The administration's spending proposal will also dole out $550 million to the Department of Energy and $215 million to the Treasury for various cybersecurity projects. And it's not just the military agencies that are getting money from the budget, Connor. It is also the state and the State Department and USAID. And some of that money is really military funding that they just hide in the State Department budget. So this I write at the Libertarian Institute. On Monday, the White House released its spending proposal for the 2023 fiscal year. The whopping $5.8 trillion budget includes $773 billion for the Pentagon. However, billions in war spending are allocated to other government agencies, including the State Department and USAID. The Biden administration spending plan calls for the two agencies to receive a combined $60 billion for various global projects. One program directed by the State Department doles out military aid. In the coming year, Israel will get $3.3 billion, Jordan will receive $1.45 billion, and Egypt will get $1.4 billion. All three states commit significant human rights abuses. A UN report recently accused Israel of committing crimes of apartheid, and Egypt's military ruler, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, imprisoned many of his political opponents in the country's most recent election. The budget request uses state and USAID to wage strategic competition against Russia and China. A State Department press release on the budget says the US will spend $4 billion to compete with Moscow and Beijing. To effectively compete with the People's Republic of China and Russia. The request includes $4 billion to support U.S. commitments to international organizations and affirms U.S. leadership at a moment when our competitors are seeking to expand their influence, and that is according to the press release. The spending also seeks to allocate $1.8 billion for a program to revitalize alliances and partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. The initiative includes $400 million for the Countering People's Republic of China Malign Influence Fund. And so I'm sure that's just, propaganda for the countries in the Indo-Pacific. I wrap up with the White House spending plan calls for $3.2 billion to advance democratization, consistent with the commitments made during President's Summit for Democracy. Biden used the summit to divide the world into two camps, democracy and autocracy. He claims democratic states must work against rising authoritarians like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. And Connor, this is so important because, if you look at what the U.S. has done in the Middle East over the past several years, obviously it's ridiculous to try to divide the world into two camps and say that we are in the good guy camp. But I think maybe more importantly, this is basically saying that the purpose of the State Department and USAID are not to improve the conditions around the world and not to really improve diplomacy and relations and peace, but rather to basically build this new Cold War paradigm and to make sure that all these other countries are forced to take a side, like Israel, like Turkey, like all these Middle Eastern states, even if they're autocrats, dictators, monarchies that chop the head off their political opposition in a literal sense, as the Saudis do. We're going to say that we want them in our camp, and this is what the State Department is going to do, so we could fight against the evil of Russia and China, and that's a really disturbing budget. Now, let's see. Do you have anything else on the budget here, Connor?
No, I was reading all of your reporting and Dave's last night. I just can't get over, like you were saying, about how the State Department, particularly those programs on China, it's just almost as if they're just an ancillary to the Pentagon, facilitating the Asia pivot and encouraging all these new partnerships. That was the policy anyway. But I mean, what more could you expect? And I mean, we were just talking about how it seems like the State Department is getting in the way now. Or the so-called diplomats are getting in the way of achieving success with the JCPOA, just to, again, build this. It's not really democracy, autocracy. It's just a brand name. But this is, like you said, is consolidating all the alliances and partnerships we have and throwing them at Russia and China and their allies and partners.
Yeah, and I actually have one more article on the budget, Connor, that I didn't load up, so anybody watching the video is just gonna have to watch me talk about from my phone. But Pentagon seeds $12 billion for missile defense and plans more space-based systems in 2023. This also at the Libertarian Institute. The whopping $813 billion war budget proposed by the White House on Monday includes $12.3 billion for missile defense programs. Over $9 billion will go to the missile defense industry, MDA. The Pentagon is hoping to deploy more space-based systems next year. The bulk of the MDA's budget, $7.9 billion, is for research and development. Some of those projects are space-based sensors meant to detect hypersonic and ballistic missiles. The Pentagon is seeking to spend over $200 million on these programs in 2023. And as we talked about with the Jason Ditz article, one of the problems is we put these systems in space and then we say, oh, they become targets of Russia and China because Russia and China are concerned about U.S. missile defense. So now we had to spend more on the Space Force to be able to defend these sensors in space that don't even work, as I'll get to at the end of the article. The spending proposal allocates over $100 million for the Aegis ashore systems in Poland and Romania. The Aegis systems are Aegis, AEGIS, are capable of launching nuclear-capable Tomahawk missiles. Russia demands the removal of the systems in its December security offer to the U.S. and NATO. Overall, the MDA's $9.6 billion budget request is slightly lower than its fiscal year 2022 budget of $10.4 billion. However, the agency only asked for $8.9 billion last year, then Congress added $1.5 billion. So who knows how high this ends up once Congress is done with it. No matter how much taxpayer money gets allocated to missile defense, the military-industrial complex has been unable to produce results. This is a statement from Frederick K. Lamb, chair of the study of physics, at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, Urbana-Champaign, and he is a expert on missile defense. He says, despite decades of work and costs totaling more than $350 billion, the United States has still not been able to field a defense that would be able to intercept even a small number of relatively unsophisticated ICBMs. He was talking and looking at an attack from North Korea and finding that America, even after all this, can't take that down. So why we're wasting another $12 billion on this, or whatever it's going to end up totaling next year, Connor, is just more of our hard-earned money thrown away for systems that don't even work, but like the Aegis Ashore system, present proliferation issues because they could load up the nuclear capable Tomahawk missiles in those launchers. And Connor, let's wrap up here on today's show and talk about your article, Don't Apologize, the Anti-War Movement Was Right, published March 24th at the Libertarian Institute. And I'll go ahead, just take a crack at it, 5-10 minutes. Let's wrap up here. Tell us what you wrote here and why it's important.
Yeah, sure. So the main I got the idea to write this just because immediately after Russia invaded Ukraine last month, there was and I understand where people are coming from, but there was an immediate sort of mea culpa from people that I very much respect in the anti-war movement, who were saying, we got this wrong. I got this wrong. I didn't expect Putin to do this. I didn't expect the Russians to do this. Oh, I really made a mistake. And there were variations on this. I mean, it was mentioned in articles and podcasts and all kinds of different Twitter. I think Snowden put out a statement like this and said he was like going to step back for a while because he made a mistake and got it wrong. And so my real point here was that is, first of all, I mean, we already saw the attacks on RT and the way people were, just basically, there was an insistence in the mainstream from people like us and people who were against the U.S. policies that were antagonizing Russia all this time to sort of like, it's almost like we were policing people in our movement were policing themselves. But at the same time, there was this, insistence that like, well, now, if you're against whatever we do from now on, then you're with Putin, or you're working for the Crown, which I suppose was a part of the culture anyway. But the stakes got raised, several orders of magnitude as a result of the invasion. So my point here is just simply that no, we don't have to apologize, and doing so, I think, it would just be a gift to the hawks and really the their complicit media apparatchiks. So I make the point here that look, the anti-war movement is not responsible for NATO expansion going back to Bill Clinton. Okay, they were against it then. As Scott Horton points out, all the graybeards, from George Kennan and Paul Nitze, Henry Kissinger and Brent Scowcroft, and all these different guys, and even Bill Perry, the Secretary of Defense under Clinton, and at the time Robert Gates, they were all against NATO expansion. Robert McNamara was against NATO expansion, and they all said the same thing, that it was going to provoke a response from Russia over time, that it was going to George Kennan goes, nobody was threatening anybody. This is totally unnecessary. The founding fathers would be rolling in their graves over this because we've signed up to protect a whole host of nations. We have neither the resources nor the serious intention to do so in the first place. So, and then you look back at the corruption of this, and it was largely a project of, some of the people that ended up at the Project for a New American Century. But in this case, I'm talking specifically about Bruce Jackson, who put money into that and funded it. But I mean, he also, rolled the project to expand NATO, the committee to expand NATO, excuse me, in the mid 90s, which Madeleine Albright, who thankfully just died, was very involved with. And Richard Pearl was on its board, and Paul Wolfowitz, and Robert Kagan, and people like this, Condoleezza Rice, who's been a real hawk this whole time in the midst of this crisis. And in fact, I remember talking with you on the show about how as soon as, when everybody was trying to make us feel ashamed for ending the war in Afghanistan. Do you know how weak and this makes us look on the world stage with all of our adversaries, and the international rules-based order is in jeopardy and all this? Condoleezza Rice is coming out and saying we should double down on our commitments to Ukraine and all this stuff. And if you look at the whole policies all the way through, these things were all opposed by the anti-war movement. I mean, the NATO encircling them with missiles, bombers, warplanes, military bases, and did the coups in their friendly nations and their near abroad, the color revolutions, overthrowing Ukraine's government twice in 10 years and putting a Nazi-infested government, as well as their security forces, which were also infested with Nazis, on Russia's border, and then throw billions and billions of dollars of military aid over to that regime, that coup regime, which they used to murder their own people in a region that contained hundreds of thousands of Russian civilians in the Donbass. I mean, this is absolutely a provocation. As Putin made clear in his speeches, that basically, I mean, honestly, if you look at what he says in his speeches, just specifically about the American provocations since the end of the Cold War, a lot of it is stuff that you would have known just from reading anti-war writers over the last several decades, because it was obvious where this was leading. And my real point is if you look at Bush ripping up the anti-ballistic missile treaty and starting the war in Georgia by had Cheney's aides providing back channel assurances to Saakashvili, who was empowered in the Rose Revolution in 2003, another color revolution that the U.S. orchestrated, putting him in power and then egging him on to start up a war with Russia by attacking Russian peacekeepers in South Ossetia. Cheney wanted to bomb Russians under the Caucasus Mountains or under the tunnels under the mountains, and we see this running all the way through with Trump, bombing Russian mercenaries in Syria, again on the calls for the no-fly zone in Syria, trying to overthrow the government of Damascus, again a key ally of Russia. These are things that the American people opposed by and large, but now we're being told that if you support this, you're one of the worst people. You're on the side of a madman, dictator, murderous thug, war criminal, all these different things. But if you look at again, as I say in the piece, that Barack Obama, well, not Barack Obama specifically, but certainly obviously he sent CIA paramilitaries and special forces to Ukraine to train these security forces to carry out their war. But Trump began arming them in 2017, and this is carried through to the Biden administration. And these people were arming them while they knew that this war had already killed, at that point, probably 10,000 people. The worst of it was 2014 to 2015. But they knowingly continued to pour billions of dollars of military aid into the country. And as you pointed out, you can go back and it's in your article with Hillary Clinton talking about how advantageous starting this kind of a conflict would be, or prolonging it with military aid and sanctions and all these things akin, specifically the military aid and the backing of an insurgency akin to, she compares it directly to Afghanistan. There are other reports or articles where they're comparing it to, it could also be like what we did to them in Syria and their allies in Syria, because the hawks are very proud of this. So my point is that they are deliberately trying to kill Russians, bleed Russia, and they did everything they could to start this war. I mean, if you look in the days just before it happened, we now know that Blinken hasn't talked to Lavrov, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, since February 15th. Berlin cut off Nord Stream 2 before the invasion took place. Blinken said, and the French foreign minister cut off talks with the Russians, which were potentially leading to a very good settlement. I mean, there was reason to be optimistic, which I think is why a lot of people maybe didn't want to believe that this was possible. But the fact is, I think we underestimated, if anything, the people who claimed they got it wrong, if anything, underestimated uh, how bad the American policymakers really are, because they risked they're right now by sharing real time intelligence by or what appears to be Psaki has made remarks that that's what they're doing before. But by sharing intelligence that is used on the battlefield, by sending in more and more, drones and Javelin anti-tank missiles and the Stinger missiles and all the other weapons aid coming from these other countries, and now it appears that they're on training to some extent Ukrainian forces in Poland. All these different things are making America a direct belligerent in the war, and at the same time, we're trying to, crush Russia. I mean, they're now the most sanctioned country in the world. And Biden let it out of the bag this weekend that the real policy here is regime change in Moscow, which the Russians and Putin himself have reportedly feared since at least the 2000s. So this is a culmination of a bipartisan policy that was opposed by a series of bipartisan policies through successive administrations, beginning with Bill Clinton, that were opposed by the anti-war movement from the left, the paleoconservative right, and the libertarians, obviously, all the way through. And everybody was opposing this hawkishness and this aggression in the lead up to the conflict because they knew that it would provoke a response. Every single one of these, every article that's written, every podcast that's done, every speech that's given, every book that's written on this topic is, it's an attempt to stop a war before it starts, or once it starts, to end it as soon as possible by telling people the truth and educating people. And so that was the underlying premise behind everything that these people were doing within the anti-war movement leading up to this. But clearly, the people in charge wanted this to be the result. In fact, you just quoted recently on the most recent show I think it's the undersecretary. The guy must be serving under Colin Kahl, I think is his name, must be serving under Newland in the political affairs. Excuse me. He's an undersecretary of state for political affairs, and was saying how no, this is going to weaken them geopolitically, economically, politically, militarily, in every single way. This is a win. So, yeah, and then I talked primarily as well about how Biden's policy, despite all the Republicans going, well, this happened because Biden is weak. It's just a complete lie. I mean, he escalated over what Trump was doing, the NATO and, well, certainly the U.S. naval presence in the Black Sea by 125% over Trump's last year in office. And if you look at the Defender Europe 21 exercises and all the massive NATO drills that were held in Eastern Europe and in many cases on Russia's borders, these were the largest war drills held since the Cold War era by NATO. So all of that is just simply not true. Before this whole, you could argue this the iteration of this current crisis that we're experiencing now. You could go back, many years, particularly back to 2014 or decades if you prefer. But, if you want to start in November, when it really, whenever they started saying they're surrounding Ukraine and building up forces on the border. Well, what was America doing then? We simulated a nuclear first strike with strategic bombers less than 13 miles, I believe 12.4 miles of multiple bombers off of Russia's borders. And Sergei Shoigu came out and said that they've increased the bomber presence near our borders this month. Biden started, he sent a guided missile destroyer there, I believe two in the beginning of November. And then, as I think one or two, both of them left, they sent another one in on Thanksgiving Day. And these ships, as you've pointed out, carry the MK-41 missile launchers. So this is, a massive security threat. And so all these different things it's just mind-boggling to me that we are supposedly supposed to be in a position to issue mea culpas and say we got it wrong when we opposed all of this. It's very, very convenient. It reminds me, I was too young to experience it then, but it would remind me of if you had opposed the policies in the Middle East that led to 9/11 the entire time, to then all of a sudden be told that you're with the terrorists for continuing to tell the truth. That, you can't let that stand. You have to take the Justin Raimondo, Ron Paul, Harry Brown approach. And so my message here is essentially to go ahead and do that, that this isn't any different. And if you look at, particularly what we were supporting as far as the war in the Donbass, which directly precipitated this crisis, at least according to the UN numbers that are confirmed so far of civilian killings, it was orders of magnitude worse what, Obama and Biden and Trump were supporting. So and there's no reason for this conflict with Russia. It puts us in the crosshairs too. We could all die in nuclear annihilation. There's no reason for that. It's just we were just discussing. All of this is just to justify massive increases in military expenditures and all the other ancillaries for the empire. And as you can see, I mean, $813 billion. The great Robert Higgs always says you take the I guess the budget, though, they said the Pentagon budget is at this point is officially in the 2023. Did you say 700 is it something like 783 or
Yep.
Yeah, Robert Higgs says you take that number and you multiply it by 2 to get the real military budget, the real what we pay on a yearly basis to fund this empire. And then, of course, the interest in all this. It is just absolute robbery. We shouldn't be standing for this. And, so I guess that's my point here, is that it is our job to not be cowed and to tell the truth and to oppose all of this. And I think we have every right to, and I don't think they have any kind of a moral high ground here. And so, yeah, it's just, that's the main message, is just that, they started this whole crisis, and I argue cultivated it up until the very days before the invasion, and now we see them obviously doing everything they can to undermine diplomacy and to prolong the war because they see it as their benefit.
All right, Connor.
In all these different ways.
All right, Connor, thanks so much for coming back on the show today. You'll be back on next week as always. And great article at the Libertarian Institute, and you'll have another great one coming out in the next few days. So everybody be sure that you're checking out the Institute, and if you can, support our fund drive. You support the work of myself and Connor, this show, and all of our writing. Thanks, Connor.
Thanks, Kyle.